Look at this. Look at this world of color, of heat, of languid sensuality. This is the Eden we were promised by Paul Gauguin. A world far from the gray industrial smog of 19th century Paris. A world of noble savages, of primal innocence, of a connection to the earth that we in our so-called civilized world had long since severed. This is the Gauguin you know. The Gauguin of the museum gift shop, the coffee table book, the art history lecture, the pioneer, the rebel, the man who sacrificed everything, a comfortable bourgeois life, a wife, 5 children, for his art. A modern saint canonized on the altar of creativity. This hagiography, this beautiful seductive story, is a lie, not just a simple misrepresentation, but a meticulously crafted fiction, built on a foundation of narcissism, exploitation, and a darkness so profound it stains every one of these vibrant canvases. The paradise he painted was a projection of his own desires, and the reality of his life there was a hell for many of those he encountered. What if I told you that the serene faces in these portraits mask stories of colonial predation, of disease, and of the sexual exploitation of children? Today, we are not here to praise Gauguin. We are here to exhume him. We will peel back the layers of myth and confront the man in all his squalor and his genius. We are going to explore the side of Paul Gauguin that his legacy has desperately tried to sanitize. The part of his story he would absolutely detest you knowing. This is not about canceling an artist. That is a cheap modern indulgence. This is about something far more challenging and far more important. Understanding the terrifying complexity of human nature and asking the eternal question, can sublime beauty be born from profound ugliness? And if so, what does that say about us, the viewers who stand in awe of it? If you believe that art, history, and truth are worth fighting for, that they demand a rigorous and unflinching gaze, then you have found your home. Subscribe to Cogitart right now. Click the like button and prepare to share this journey. Because what we are about to uncover changes everything you thought you knew about one of art's most celebrated figures. To truly understand the monstrous ego of the man, we must first understand the wound that festered at the core of his being. Paul Gauguin was born into a world of upheaval. His father, a radical journalist, fled France after the 1848 revolution, dragging his young family towards a supposed new beginning in Peru. It was on this voyage that his father died suddenly. His body unceremoniously dropped into the vast, indifferent ocean. Imagine that. A boy, not yet 2, his world defined by a loss he could not comprehend, but would feel for the rest of his life. He was raised for several years in Lima, in the household of his great-uncle, a viceroy of Peru. Here, amidst the vivid colors and what he later remembered as a primitive and luxurious languor, the seeds of a fantasy were sown. He would later boast of his Incan blood, a lineage that was, at best, a fabrication, a romantic embellishment, but it was a necessary one for him. It gave him a claim to a world outside and against the Europe he would come to despise. It was his original sin and his founding myth. He was not one of them. He was a savage. This manufactured identity lay dormant for decades. Upon returning to France, Gauguin did not immediately pick up a paintbrush. No, he did what any ambitious young man of his time would do. He sought wealth and stability. He joined the French Navy, then became a remarkably successful stockbroker in Paris. He was, by all accounts, a model of bourgeois prosperity. He married a Danish woman, Mette Sophie Gad, and with her he had 5 children. He had a fine apartment, a collection of impressionist art, and a comfortable, predictable future. He was a man in a cage of his own making, a golden cage, but a cage nonetheless. And inside, the savage was beginning to rattle the bars. He painted on the side, a Sunday painter, a talented amateur in the orbit of Pissarro and the Impressionists. But a nagging, cancerous ambition was growing within him. He did not want to be a hobbyist. He did not want to be a follower. He craved a legacy. He craved a significance that his stock market dealings could never provide. The financial crash of 1882 gave him the excuse he needed. It was his road to Damascus moment, but one stripped of any divine humility. He announced to his horrified wife, Mette, that he was abandoning finance to become a full-time painter. Let us be brutally clear about what this meant. This was not a noble sacrifice for a higher calling. This was an act of supreme, almost sociopathic selfishness. He did not consult his wife. He did not make provisions for his 5 children. He simply decided that his artistic genius a genius that at this point was largely unproven and existed mostly in his own mind, trumped all familial and social responsibility. He dragged his family from the comfort of Paris to the provincial dreariness of Rouen. And then, when the money ran out, he effectively abandoned them. Mette was forced to return to her family in Copenhagen, taking the children with her, to work as a translator and teacher to keep them from starving. His letters from this period are a masterclass in psychological manipulation and narcissistic self-pity. He portrays himself as the victim, the misunderstood martyr suffering for his art. He writes to Mette, not with love or concern for his children, but with demands for money and complaints about his own hardships. He castigates her for not believing in his genius, for not selling his paintings for the high prices he felt they deserved. Read his words. I am a great artist, and I know it. It is because I am that I have endured such suffering. There is no sense of culpability, no remorse for the poverty and emotional desolation he has inflicted on his own family. They are merely inconvenient obstacles on his path to glory. He had cut the cord, not just to his life as a stockbroker, but to his life as a husband and a father. The savage was free, and his first act of freedom was to devour his own kin. His journey then took him to Brittany, to the artist's colony of Pont-Aven. Here he began to truly cultivate his persona. He was no longer Paul Gauguin, the failed stockbroker. He was Gauguin, the master. He strode through the village in a Breton waistcoat and wooden clogs, brandishing a walking stick he had carved himself. A theatrical performance of authenticity. He gathered around him a coterie of younger, less talented artists, men like Émile Bernard and Paul Sérusier, who became his disciples. He did not teach them in the academic sense. He pontificated. He laid down the law of his new art, synthetism, an art that rejected the Impressionists' fleeting obsession with light and surface in favor of bold outlines, flat planes of pure color, and memory-infused symbolism. Do not copy nature too much, he commanded. Art is an abstraction. He was charismatic, certainly, but he was also a bully. He was domineering, argumentative, and cruel to those he perceived as rivals or inferiors. He held court, demanding sycophantic praise and brooked no dissent. He was creating a cult of personality, with himself as the high priest. It was in this crucible of ego that he forged the style that would make him famous. His Breton paintings, like The Vision After the Sermon or The Yellow Christ, are powerful. They are a radical departure from everything that had come before, but they are also deeply imbued with his own arrogance. In The Yellow Christ, he famously used his own features for the face of the crucified Jesus. The symbolism is inescapable. He is the artist as martyr, suffering for the sins of a world that cannot understand his greatness. It is a breathtaking act of self-aggrandizement, a piece of blasphemous propaganda for the Church of Gauguin. This period of his life culminates in the most infamous episode in all of art history, his disastrous stay with Vincent van Gogh in Arles in the autumn of 1888. The story is often told as a tragic clash of two titanic but incompatible artistic temperaments. This is a romantic oversimplification. It was a collision between a man of immense, raw, and fragile sensitivity, Van Gogh, and a cold, calculating narcissist, Gauguin. Vincent, financed by his long-suffering brother Theo, had a dream. He dreamt of a studio of the South, an artistic brotherhood living and working together under the vibrant sun of Provence. He idolized Gauguin, seeing him as the leader this movement needed. He begged him to come to Arles, and Theo paid for Gauguin's travel and expenses. Gauguin, for his part, was broke and saw a free meal ticket. He had little genuine respect for Vincent as a person, often mocking his emotional intensity and his clumsy, heartfelt idealism. The Yellow House in Arles became a psychological pressure cooker. Vincent, desperate for approval, worked at a feverish pace. Gauguin, cool and critical, set himself up as the master, dissecting Vincent's work with a detached cruelty. He encouraged Vincent to paint from memory, from imagination, pushing him away from the direct contact with nature that was the source of his spiritual and artistic sustenance. You can see the tension in their canvases. They painted the same subjects, the local cafe, their landlady, but their interpretations are worlds apart. Van Gogh's paintings pulse with a nervous, empathetic energy. Gauguin's are aloof, decorative, and tinged with a condescending irony. The inevitable explosion came on the 23rd of December, after a furious argument, the exact details of which are lost to history, but likely involved Gauguin announcing his departure, Vincent, in a state of complete psychotic breakdown, took a razor and mutilated his own left ear. The popular myth has Gauguin fleeing in terror from a madman. The reality, as pieced together from letters and accounts, is far more damning. Gauguin's own account is self-serving and changes over time. He presents himself as the calm, rational man dealing with a lunatic. But it is highly probable that his relentless psychological pressure, his cold disdain, and his threat of abandonment were the final catalysts that pushed the profoundly unstable Vincent over the edge. Gauguin did not stay to help. He did not call for a doctor. He packed his bags, spent the night in a hotel, and took the first train to Paris the next morning, leaving Vincent bleeding and alone to be discovered by the police. He never saw him again. Gauguin's role in this tragedy was not that of a passive observer. It was that of an active, if perhaps unwitting, tormentor. He saw Vincent's vulnerability not as something to be protected, but as something to be exploited, and ultimately discarded when it became inconvenient. And it is here, in the wake of this human wreckage, that Gauguin's grandest and most pernicious fantasy begins to take shape. Europe had failed him. Its artists were madmen, its critics were fools, and its society was a prison. He needed to escape, to find a place untouched by the sickness of civilization, a place where he could live out his myth of the savage. He needed to go to Tahiti. Before we follow him into the heart of his manufactured darkness, a moment of reflection. The story we are telling is not an easy one. It challenges the comfortable narratives we build around our cultural heroes. Here at Cogitart, we believe this challenge is essential. We are committed to digging deeper, to providing context and analysis that respects your intelligence. If this is the kind of content you value, then please take a second to ensure you are subscribed to the channel, give this video a like, and consider sharing it. Your support is what allows us to continue this vital work of historical and artistic inquiry. Now, to Tahiti. Gauguin arrived in Papeete in 1891, financed by a government commission that he had secured through friends, a commission he had little intention of fulfilling in any conventional sense. He expected to step off the boat into the world of his paintings before he had even painted them. He expected a pre-lapsarian Eden, populated by carefree, brown-skinned Venuses. What he found was a French colony. He found a capital city with colonial administrators, gendarmes, and Catholic missionaries. The ancient culture he had dreamed of was already eroded, replaced by imported religion, imported disease, and imported laws. The noble savage was a ghost. His disappointment was palpable. In his journal, Noah, a book that is part travelogue, part self-mythologizing fiction, he writes of his disillusionment. But a narcissist of Gauguin's caliber does not allow reality to interfere with his narrative. If the paradise did not exist, he would invent it, and he would populate it with subjects who had no power to refuse him. He left the civilized capital of Papeete and moved to a more rural district. And it is here that the story turns from one of mere artistic arrogance to one of undeniable, systematic predation. He needed a companion, a muse, a vahine. This is the Tahitian word for woman, a word he imbued with exotic, erotic fantasy. The woman he found, his first and most famous Tahitian wife, was named Teha Amana, or Tehura, as he called her. When he painted her, in works like the masterpiece Spirit of the Dead Watching, Manau Tupapau, he presented her as a woman, a mysterious other, embodying the primitive soul of her people. The truth, which he conveniently omits from his romanticized accounts, is that Teha Amana was a child. By most scholarly estimates, she was just 13 years old when her family, likely for a small price, gave her to the 43-year-old French artist. Let us not mince words. Let us not hide behind the flimsy excuse of, it was a different time. This was the sexual exploitation of a minor. He was a middle-aged European man of immense privilege and power, taking a child for his sexual and artistic gratification. He did not speak her language. She knew nothing of his world. She was for him an object, a beautiful, savage object onto which he could project his fantasies. His book Noah describes their marriage in terms that are, to a modern reader, chilling. He presents it as a simple, natural transaction, a charming local custom. He glosses over the terror and confusion this child must have felt. That very painting, Spirit of the Dead Watching, is the ultimate testament to his cruelty and his genius. The official story, Gauguin's story, is that he came home late one night to find Teha Amana lying terrified in the dark, frozen with fear of the Tupapau, the spirit of the dead. He claimed the painting captured this authentic moment of native superstition. But art historians and critics have offered a more plausible and far more disturbing interpretation. The terror on the girl's face is not of a ghost, but of him. The terror is of the man who owns her, the large, aging European who enters her room in the dead of night. The spirit of the dead watching is not some folkloric ghoul. It is Gauguin himself, the artist, observing her terror, objectifying it, and transmuting it into a beautiful, saleable image. He is both the cause of the fear and its cold chronicler. In this single canvas, the entire dynamic of his Tahitian project is laid bare: colonial power, sexual dominance, and the alchemical process by which an artist turns human suffering he directly causes, into a masterpiece. He didn't just capture a moment of fear, he engineered it, and then he sold it as an authentic slice of primitive life. This was not an isolated incident. This was his modus operandi. When Teha eventually left him, returning to her own people, he simply acquired another child bride. Her name was Paura, and she was, by most accounts, around 14 years old. He would have 2 children with her, both of whom he would abandon with the same callous indifference he had shown to his 5 legitimate children in Denmark. He saw these girls and the children they bore him not as human beings with lives and futures of their own, but as props in the grand theater of his own life. They were there to provide him with sexual comfort, to pose for his paintings, and to validate his fantasy of being a white chieftain in a tropical harem. And there is a darker, more biological dimension to his predation. Gauguin was dying. He had contracted syphilis, likely in the brothels of Paris years earlier. This was a slow, agonizing death sentence in the 19th century, marked by painful sores, neurological decay, and eventual madness. He brought this disease with him to Tahiti, to a population that had already been decimated by European illnesses against which they had no immunity. He was, quite literally, a vector of death. It is almost certain that he infected the young girls he took as his wives. He writes in his letters of his weeping sores, of his constant pain, yet frames it as part of his artistic martyrdom. He never once displays a shred of concern for the health of the women he was sleeping with. Their bodies were his to use and to poison. The paradise he painted was, for them, a place of contagion and exploitation. Look again at the paintings from this period. Look at Vahine no Titiare, Woman with a Flower, or Nafea fa Ipoipo, When Will You Marry? We see these serene, melancholy faces and we are told they represent the enigmatic soul of Polynesia. What if, instead, they represent the faces of captives? The resigned, somber expressions of children trapped in a situation they cannot escape, their youth and innocence being steadily consumed by an old sick man from another world. The titles he gives them are his own projections. When will you marry? Was not a question the girls were asking each other. It was a question that defined their value in a colonial context where their marriageability to European men was a route to survival for their families. Gauguin rips these girls from their context and places them in his, turning them into symbols of a primitive purity that he himself was actively corrupting. His project in Tahiti was a failure in every way but the artistic. He failed to find the untouched paradise he sought. He failed to make significant money. He was racked with disease and loneliness. So, in 1893, he scraped together enough money to return to France, hoping for a triumphal re-entry. He arrived in Paris not as a humble artist but as a living spectacle. He walked the streets with a Javanese mistress, a monkey on his shoulder, dressed in elaborate, self-designed, savage costumes. It was a pathetic, desperate performance. He was trying to bring the fantasy of Tahiti to the gray streets of Paris, but the city was not impressed. An exhibition of his Tahitian works was a critical and commercial disaster. The public saw only ugly, disproportionate figures and garish colors. They did not see his genius. His time in France ended, as it so often did, in violence and self-pity. During a trip to Brittany, he and his friends got into a brawl with a group of sailors. Gauguin's ankle was shattered in the fight, an injury that would leave him in chronic, agonizing pain for the rest of his life. Lying in a hospital bed, he learned that his Javanese mistress had fled, robbing him of everything he owned. It was the final straw. He had tried to conquer Paris, and Paris had broken him. Defeated, embittered, and in more pain than ever, he made his final decision. He would return to Polynesia. Not in triumph, but in retreat. He would go there to die. "I am leaving in order to have peace and to be rid of the influence of civilization," he wrote. "I want to do simple, very simple art." This was his final, great self-deception. He was not seeking peace. He was seeking oblivion. In 1895, he landed in Tahiti for the second and last time. But this was not the same man who had arrived 4 years earlier. He was now 57 years old, his body ravaged by syphilis, his leg a source of constant torment, his spirit crushed. He was increasingly reliant on morphine to dull the pain. The paradise, which had always been a fiction, now became his personal inferno. His letters from this period are a litany of suffering. "My health gets worse and worse," he wrote to a friend. "I have just spat blood, which has rather frightened me. It is my heart that is affected now." He built a rudimentary hut for himself and Paola, the young girl who was still with him. He fathered a daughter with her, a child he would never see grow up. The art he produced became darker, more philosophical, more obsessed with the great, unanswerable questions of existence. The vibrant sensuality of his first trip gave way to a profound, almost funereal, melancholy. He was a man staring into the abyss, and his art was a reflection of the darkness he saw there. This period culminates in the creation of his definitive masterpiece, the vast canvas that he intended to be his last will and testament. Its title is not a statement, but a series of questions that haunted him. D'où venons-nous? Que sommes-nous? Où allons-nous? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? He painted it in a feverish, month-long burst of creative energy, convinced he was at death's door. He described it as a philosophical work, a grand summation of his thoughts on life, death, and the human condition. Look at the painting. It is read from right to left, like a sacred scroll. On the right, a newborn baby, representing the beginning of life. In the center, a figure picks fruit, a symbol of our daily existence, of what we are. On the left, an old woman, hands to her head, resigns herself to death, representing where we are going. The background is filled with other figures, mysterious idols, and a landscape that is both Tahitian and utterly imaginary. It is a work of staggering ambition and profound beauty. But once again, let us strip away the myth. After completing this monumental canvas, Gauguin, in a fit of despair, walked into the mountains behind his hut and swallowed a massive dose of arsenic, intending to kill himself. It was a fittingly dramatic end for a man who had staged his entire life. But even in this, he failed. The dose was so large that his body violently rejected it, leaving him in excruciating pain but still alive. He crawled back to his hut to face more years of misery. The grand gesture had been botched. The painting, therefore, is not the serene philosophical meditation of a sage. It is a suicide note. It is the final, desperate cry of a man who has failed at everything. As a husband, as a father, as a friend, and ultimately, in his own eyes, as a man. He has used the bodies of the Tahitian people as the canvas for his own existential terror. The profound questions, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Are not their questions. They are his. He has colonized not just their land and their bodies, but their very souls, using them as symbolic stand-ins for a universal humanity that he himself felt alienated from. The painting is a work of genius, yes, but it is a genius born of complete spiritual bankruptcy, a final, magnificent act of cultural and personal appropriation. His final years were spent not in Tahiti, but in the even more remote Marquesas Islands, on the island of Hiva-Oa. This was the end of the line. If Tahiti was a corrupted paradise, the Marquesas were, in his mind, the last bastion of true savagery. He arrived in 1901, a broken man, seeking a final refuge. He built a large, 2-story wooden house for himself, a defiant statement in the small Catholic mission village. He gave it a name that was a calculated insult to the church authorities he despised: Maison du Jouir, the House of Pleasure. He decorated it with his own explicit wood carvings, celebrating the pagan sensuality he championed. Here, in his final outpost, his hypocrisy reached its zenith. He took yet another young companion, a girl named Vaioho, who was again no older than 14. He styled himself as a champion of the native people, writing furious letters to the colonial administration, protesting their mistreatment by the Catholic mission and the local gendarme. He saw himself as a righteous crusader, fighting for the freedom of the oppressed. He was utterly blind to the fact that he was, himself, a colonizer of the most intimate and destructive kind. He fought against the public, institutional power of the church and state, while privately enacting his own reign of personal, sexualized power over the most vulnerable members of the native community. He was fighting a fire in the town square while setting one in his own bedroom. His health continued to disintegrate. The sores from his syphilis were open and weeping. The pain in his leg was so intense he could barely walk. He was addicted to morphine and absinthe. His final self-portraits are terrifying. The confident, defiant gaze of his earlier years is gone, replaced by a haunted, frightened stare. He is a man hollowed out by pain and despair. On the morning of May 8, 1903, a neighbor, concerned by his absence, went to check on him. He found Paul Gauguin dead, alone in his bed in the House of Pleasure. He was 54 years old. His death was as squalid and lonely as his final years had been. The great mythmaker, the self-proclaimed savage, died not in a blaze of glory but from a heart attack, likely complicated by a morphine overdose. His worldly possessions were few: a handful of paintings, his explicit wood carvings, and a collection of pornographic photographs. The contents of his House of Pleasure were auctioned off for a pittance. The local bishop, his longtime enemy, made sure that his grave was placed in the Catholic cemetery, a final, ironic act of institutional absorption for a man who had defined his life in opposition to it. So, we are left with the great, unsettling paradox of Paul Gauguin. How do we hold these two truths in our minds at once? The truth of the art, the revolutionary color, the bold, simplified forms, the profound spiritual longing that radiates from his best canvases, and the truth of the man, the narcissist, the deadbeat father, the manipulator, the colonial predator, the pedophile. The modern temptation is to choose one and discard the other, to cancel the man, and by extension, the art, or conversely to engage in the old lazy argument that we must separate the art from the artist, to pretend that the sublime beauty of the work somehow exists in a vacuum, untainted by the moral squalor of its creator. Both of these positions are a dereliction of our intellectual and ethical duty. The truth, the difficult and challenging truth that Gauguin himself would hate for you to understand, is that the art and the life are not separate. They are inextricably, terrifyingly intertwined. The paintings are not beautiful in spite of the man's darkness. They are beautiful, in a complex and disturbing way, because of it. His narcissistic belief in his own genius is what gave him the audacity to break every rule of Western art. His selfish abandonment of his family was the precondition for his journey. His colonial fantasy, his desire to possess and consume the primitive, is the very subject matter of his most famous works. The tension you feel when you know the story behind the paintings, the tension between the languid beauty of the surface and the violent reality of its creation, is the source of their enduring power. To look at a Gauguin painting and see only a tropical paradise is to remain a willing participant in his century-old deception. To truly see it is to see the ghost of a 13-year-old girl, the shadow of colonial power, the ravages of disease, and the profound, selfish despair of a man who destroyed worlds, both his own and others, to create his art. He does not ask for our forgiveness, he asks for our adoration. And perhaps the most radical act we can perform as viewers is to deny him that simple comfort. We can instead look with clear eyes, acknowledging the aesthetic power of his work while simultaneously bearing witness to the human cost it entailed. This is not about condemnation for its own sake. It is about a deeper, more honest, and ultimately more profound engagement with art. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that beauty is not always a product of virtue, and that genius can be a monstrous, consuming force. To understand Gauguin is not to excuse him, but to understand the dark, complex, and often cruel heart of human creativity itself. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey. Here at Cogitart, we are dedicated to peeling back the varnish of history to reveal the complex truths beneath. If you believe this kind of critical engagement is important, please subscribe to the channel, click the like button, and share this video with anyone who isn't afraid to look into the shadows. We have many more stories to tell, many more myths to dismantle. Click here to explore our other videos and continue the conversation. The beauty of art is not in its comfortable lies, but in its challenging truths.